This happened a few years ago when I was living in a college town. I was finishing my last semester, while my friends still had 2 more to go. To save some money, I decided to rent a room in a house with 2 guys I found on Craigslist. I know that might sound unusual, but that's not the odd part. One day, I went for a run around the neighborhood and, when I got back, I immediately hopped in the shower. While I had shampoo in my hair, I heard loud banging at the front door. I figured it was probably friends of my 2 roommates, since they were close, so I didn't think much of it at first. But the banging didn't stop, it got louder and more intense. Then, I heard a loud crash from just outside the bathroom. I quickly grabbed a towel, ready to check what was going on, but before I could even move, the bathroom door swung open. There was a man standing in the doorway, someone I had never seen before, just staring at me. Another man peeked around the corner from the hallway. The first guy told me to get on the ground. I refused, but I had no idea how to get out of the situation safely. Then I remembered my phone was in my bedroom. My only plan was to somehow get out of the bathroom and grab it. I took a deep breath and tried to leave, but after that, my memory becomes a blur. The next thing I recall comes from what my roommates later told me. Thankfully, they were home. They heard me screaming and rushed out of their rooms. When the man saw my roommates, he released me, looking frustrated and desperate. He started demanding money, but my roommates, scared and confused, told him they didn't have any money and didn't know who he was. Realizing he might have the wrong house, after a tense moment, the 2 men left, slamming the front door behind them. This is where my memory picks back up. I collapsed on the floor, crying uncontrollably, unable to believe what had just happened. I lay there, curled up on the ground, until I finally regained some control and went to my room to call my mom. I could barely explain what had happened to her. When the police arrived, they confirmed that the noise I had heard earlier was the 2 men kicking in our old, flimsy 1920s door. They told me they'd do what they could to help, but this was the 50th home invasion they had responded to that day, and it wasn't even noon. Now, a decade later, it's still hard for me to talk about that day. I moved into my apartment in November 2018, after my ex-wife asked me to leave. It was a tough period for me, but I ended up finding a roommate through Craigslist. He was a work traveler, so he was often away for long stretches of time. When we first met, he seemed like a friendly and easygoing guy, and I thought things would go smoothly. However, as time passed, I began to feel uneasy living there. One day, I decided to ask him more about the apartment and himself. Everything seemed normal until I asked if anything strange ever happened, like odd noises or unusual neighbors. He paused for a moment and said, "Sometimes, it feels like you're not really alone here." He added that he didn't believe in ghosts but mentioned that, on certain days, it felt like someone else was in the apartment. About 2 months later, I had my first strange experience with what I now call Frank. It was around 5 a.m., and still dark since it was winter. The room felt quiet and cold, typical for that time of year. When I looked over at my closet, I noticed something strange. The closet is just an open space in the wall, but it seemed darker than usual. Right in the center, I saw a tall, black shadow standing there. A chill ran down my neck, even though I was under 2 blankets. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore it, and eventually fell back asleep. The next odd event happened and my son visited the apartment for the first time. After a long legal battle, I finally had custody rights. My son, who was 7 months old, spent the day with me, crawling around and playing. His mom had warned me he was afraid of bathtubs, so instead, I used a large mineral bucket I had for his bath. As I was preparing it, that same unsettling feeling crept up my spine, but I tried to brush it off. The apartment was darker than usual since my roommate was out of town, leaving just me and my son. Once he fell asleep, I noticed something odd again. A shadow slipped out of my room. Curious, I followed it into the living room and noticed one corner was far darker than it should have been. I stared at it for a couple of minutes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I turned on the lights, and the shadow disappeared. Later that night, I was woken up around 2 or 3 a.m. by strange sounds, like someone was moving furniture in the apartment. I could hear faint footsteps and what sounded like soft humming. I didn't want to leave my son's side, so I stayed in bed, listening for about 20 minutes as the sounds continued. Finally, I got up and went into the living room. As I walked down the hallway, a cold breeze hit me, and I froze when I saw my dining table. The mineral bucket I had used earlier was now sitting on one of the chairs, and my son's little shoes were placed on top of it. Another strange moment happened after a night out with friends. I don't usually drink much, but I decided to have one drink before coming home. As I entered the apartment and started making food in the kitchen, I noticed how quiet it was. I was opening the fridge when I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing near the table, watching me. Instead of panicking, I decided to speak to Frank. I set some boundaries, telling him to stay away from my son. I also promised to leave the bathroom door cracked open and keep the lights off at night, as if it was his own private space. After I finished talking, the figure disappeared. Since then, I've had small encounters with Frank. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of him in the shadows, and other times things in the apartment move on their own, chairs, doors, and the like. It's unsettling, but Frank has never harmed me or my son. It feels like he's just a part of the place now. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or anything paranormal. I'm convinced that science can explain everything, but I can't stop thinking about what happened during a recent camping trip with my wife, Amanda. Last Saturday, we decided to take our 2 dogs, Max and Luna, and spend some time in the forest to escape the hectic city life and enjoy some peace and quiet in nature. We packed up our tent, food, and supplies and headed to a campsite about an hour away. We live in Washington State and love hiking and camping, but we prefer avoiding crowded campgrounds. Instead, we always seek out remote spots deep in the wilderness where we can be completely surrounded by nature. That weekend, we found an ideal spot about 10 miles down an old forest road, deep in the national forest, with towering trees all around us. On the way, we passed a few other campers, but they were spread out along the road, and we eventually found a secluded spot all to ourselves, far from any other people. There was no cell signal, no connection to the outside world, just the 2 of us and nature. That night, we went to bed around 10 p.m. The temperature, which had been in the 70s, quickly dropped into the 40s, so we bundled up inside our tent to stay warm. I'm a light sleeper, so I tend to wake up at the slightest noise, and that night was no exception. The sound of leaves rustling or twigs snapping would stir me from sleep, and on top of that, our dogs kept wriggling between Amanda and me, trying to get comfortable, which pushed me closer to the edge of the tent. Eventually, morning came. I stayed in my sleeping bag, listening to the birds chirping and the gentle rustling of the leaves. It was around 5 a.m., and the cool air was seeping into the tent. As I lay there, enjoying the early morning stillness, I suddenly heard something that made my heart race. A woman's voice, coming from about 50 feet away, called out, "Is Amanda here?" A wave of fear washed over me. My face grew hot as I realized I had no idea who it was. I lay there, frozen, waiting for what felt like 10 minutes to hear the voice again or any sign of someone walking nearby. But all I could hear were the morning birds. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up, open the tent, and look around. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and there was no sign of anyone nearby, let alone a woman. I started to relax, convincing myself that maybe I'd been drifting in and out of sleep and had just dreamed it. But the voice felt so real, so vivid, that I couldn't shake the feeling something unusual had happened. When Amanda woke up, I told her about it, and she said I must have been dreaming too. We decided to pack up early and head home to finish some chores before the new work week began. It was nice to be out in nature, but I had a strong urge to get home. Now, 3 days later, I still haven't been able to come up with any explanation other than that it was a dream, but the memory is so vivid. I've even searched online to see if anyone else has experienced something similar or if there are any old stories about hearing voices in the forest, but I haven't found anything. I just can't seem to shake the feeling that something strange happened that morning. I haven't shared this with anyone except my boyfriend and his brother. When I told them, his brother laughed and acted like I was imagining things, so I decided not to bring it up again. But the experience has been stuck in my head ever since, and I can't stop thinking about what I saw. I live in England, where there's a lot of countryside, and that day I was driving along a small country road near a main road. Between the two roads was a wide, open field with bushes along the edge separating them. The area was pretty quiet, with only a few cars passing on the main road. While talking to my boyfriend, I suddenly saw a very tall, human-like figure standing by the roadside. It looked extremely thin, like it was just skin and bones, and it didn't seem to be wearing any clothes. Its skin was pale, and it looked unhealthy, almost as if it was sick or frail. I couldn't make out its face clearly because it moved too fast, but from the quick glimpse I got, its facial features seemed blurred, almost like they had been smudged or digitally altered. It darted across the road in front of me, moving into the open field. I slowed down and looked back to see where it had gone. It was early evening, and the sun was setting, so it was getting darker, but there was still enough light to see the field. I scanned the area, trying to spot it, but it had completely disappeared. There was no tall grass or anything it could have hidden behind, the field was completely open. No human could have crossed the entire field that quickly to reach the bushes on the other side. It was as if the figure had just vanished into thin air. My boyfriend wanted me to stop the car and go check, but I was too scared. My heart was racing, and every instinct told me to keep driving, so I did. I'm not sure if I should have stopped to investigate, but I just couldn't. Since that day, I haven't been able to shake the fear I felt in that moment, and I keep replaying the whole thing in my mind. I've been searching for an explanation, but the only one that makes sense to me is that it was something paranormal. If it had been a person, how could they disappear like that without a trace? Last spring, my husband and I ended up going to a Fleetwood Mac concert, even though we hadn't planned on it. At the last minute, my husband decided to check Craigslist for tickets. He found an ad and responded, but we weren't sure if it would work out. We waited, thinking it might fall through. Then, just before the concert, the person we had contacted sent us the tickets via email, without even asking for payment. It was completely unexpected, but we were thrilled because we both love their music, especially Stevie Nicks. When we got to the venue, we were surprised at how smoothly everything went, and security was quick and easy. As we walked in, we were amazed to discover that our seats were right in the center, on the floor, very close to the stage. The venue was huge, it's the same place where NHL games and concerts are held, and we couldn't believe how lucky we were. While watching the band perform, my husband pointed out the video images on the big screen behind them. The screen showed a silhouette of a woman dancing, and my husband mentioned how much it looked like me. I laughed at first, but then I realized he was right. The way she moved was just like the way I dance, and her silhouette even matched my hair and the shape of a vintage dress I own. As she danced, ravens flew across the screen, and she raised her arms like a bird. Strangely enough, I found myself moving in the same way as the silhouette before I had even noticed it on the screen. At the time, I thought maybe we were just projecting what we wanted to see. After the concert, when we got home, my husband said he felt like he was watching some kind of energy being transferred to me during the performance. I should mention that I'm a singer, and at that point in my life, I was just starting to get back into writing and creating music. It felt like a good sign, but I didn't think too much of it. Later, I watched a few interviews with Stevie Nicks and found one where she mentioned a book called Triad that had inspired her song, Rhiannon. I told myself I'd check out the book, but I ended up forgetting about it. A few months later, I decided to turn the second bedroom in our apartment, which was mostly empty, into a closet. I ordered some racks from IKEA to organize everything. The room was a complete mess that week, with piles of clothes and shoes everywhere. While I was sorting things out, I stumbled across a stack of books that I had never seen before. I knew for certain I hadn't bought them, and they definitely weren't in the room before. They looked really old and dusty, with some even covered in cobwebs. As I went through the books, my heart stopped when I saw one of them. It was Triad. I immediately asked my husband if he had brought them in, but he had no idea where they came from either. I believed him, since I hadn't mentioned wanting the book or any of the others to him. For weeks, I kept thinking about how those books had ended up in the room, but I still don't have an answer. When I first saw the cover of Triad, I was completely shocked. I have no way of explaining how it got there, but the whole experience has felt incredibly special and surreal.